Okay, so here's our second talk from Professor Mario Fifish. Actually, I knew Mario for like 15 years ago, 15 years. So we met at the Psychonomics conference. So when Mario and when I was a PhD student, so I came to Mario's poster, and I just know one who can do SFT. So we just shared the research interest, and we have a very great chat at that time, and we were long time collaborating on many stuffs. So from the phase stuff to right now we have the group decision making and aging stuff. So today Mario is going to talk about the analytic versus holistic processing using the MSPN model. So it's SFT, okay. So it's a very great chance to have Mario here again. So actually, Mario will take his sabbatical again in Taiwan.
Depends on the funding.
It depends on the funding. We're trying hard to get the fund for Mario. So let's welcome Mario Fifish.
Okay, thank you, Chengta, for the kind words. We are very happy now that you invited us here to organize such a wonderful event, to share, to provide this platform for sharing ideas, and have this kind of create this, very good scientific atmosphere for young and progressive students, that most of the whom work, we saw yesterday, very good. So probably, you can have some of these ideas about your future work after seeing some of these presentations. So that is very important. So feel free to contact or ask questions. You can find, for example, you can see some of the signatures. This is my Decide Lab. And you can find some of the papers and the currently going research, on that web page. So, or feel free to ask me anything or share slides, more than happy, to provide this information if required. So we'll talk about a phenomenon holistic perception. So before we start the talk, let me ask you give you one task. So I'm gonna show you next slide, and you have to quickly tell me without much thinking, what do you see on the next slide? Are you ready? Is everybody ready? Good. What do you see? Sorry, a person? Who? That's right. So some of you guys, indicated, exact the name and identity of the person. It is a famous badminton player, Taiwanese, one of the most famous person in Taiwan's, eyes, and also known, internationally. Well, some of you who are not really familiar with the face indicated, that is a face of a maybe certain gender and properties. So those of you who kind of go directly for the identity, demonstrate very clearly this holistic effect in perception and how that works. Well, even if no one of you actually provided as an answer, I see dark hair with the 2 ears on the left and right, with a ring in one, and then there's a position of chin, and there's a specific color. No one mentioned that. Well, although this information is available, most of you actually went directly for the final perceptual effect that usually characterizes some form of perception, which we call kind of a perception of faces. And perception of faces usually involve this kind of a holistic effect, seeing things together and then seeing them as a one, combine all these properties together and seeing them as a one property, right? So how what happens actually, let's say in your brain system, right, in the cognitive functions. The good thing is we know a lot about how the visual processing system works. And it's been done really very carefully with the humans. So most of the projections start here in the V1 and then make, their later on processing the information that is being projected to the back of the occipital region of our skull and of the brain is a V1 that usually analyzes features, basic features, lines that could be of different orientation. We know that very well with the humans and for the most of the animals. Now, if this information has been moved, higher and higher in the brain structure and ends up here in the inferotemporal region, then actually there's also location of fusiform area, which is kind of known to have been directly linked to perception of whole faces. And perhaps there we can find, that face, that you directly recognize in its total presentation. There are other faces there that you maybe recognize as some of the presenters here. There's a Jim, there's a Joe, Chang Tai, and then other faces, you're familiar with, your faces of your family, maybe even your faces when you look in a mirror, you memorize yourself somehow. This is the place where we hold this identities, right? Where we hold these holistic representations. Now, what is interesting here is that we know that along the path, the bits of pieces of these holistic representations are scattered around. And we know that very basic features are over there. So the question is, how do we connect, these two systems, right? How that we go, from the creating this unified holistic representations from the basic features. How do we build this up, together? We talk about this holistic perception. So the question is, how do you end up, in this region over there when you're making your perceptual decisions? We believe, that behind the decision making, there are some kind of, at the conceptual level, networks being involved in the combination of these features. So some of these networks could be organized in a different way. Jim already introduces some of these networks. I can only tell you, for example, that this one is a network made of 4 processes that are sequentially organized. So the process 1 could be maybe analyzing eyes, process 1 could be analyzing lips, and so on and so forth, right? But this network is a little bit different, right? It has the same 4 processes, but they run at the same time in parallel. Well, this network's even more complicated, but you can see that, taking different paths, this one can either go serial or parallel or combine them both, So in the essence, we would like to uncover the structures of the brain processes, through these conceptual, cognitive, mental architectures. And we believe, that these mental architectures are buried, somewhere on this path from the very first visual area to the higher level visual areas. So how to uncover them? Well, we usually measure some kind of responses, in this case, response times. If you just measure response times, there will be sort of like, you have distributions, frequency of a distributions of certain times, and it looks, very nice, here. But what do we learn, for example, for the response times to indicate what is the underlying mental architecture? So we develop, this kind of tools spearheaded by the Professor Townsend. It is actually the idea is to develop tools to analyze response time in a particular fashion to conduct reverse engineering, right? We would like to go back and to see, how the brain works, right? So how the cognitive functions operate. And to do that, we have to have appropriate set of tools. So is it possible to reveal some of these mental architectures, right? Now, if you have the response time as a tool to look at these processes, we have to have one word of caution here. These processes are very fast. Identification of faces or objects happen even less than 1 second, less than half second, less than 300 milliseconds according to some research. Maybe 100 milliseconds sometimes is sufficient for us to get. So how to utilize and catch and slow down this process so we understand the network behind it. The first guy that actually provided tool to developing these techniques was Donders, and Donders invented all kinds of tools. Remember, it is 1868 approximately, and these are the mechanical tools that were used to measure times less than 1 second. It was really remarkable methods developed, to introduce one of the most important variables in cognitive psychology, such as response times. And then original ideas to create two tasks. One task was simple detection. The other task, involves one more process. Some of these tools, look very ancient. And remember, at those times, no electronics. So you cannot really rely on all the gadgets that we have today. It has to be done kind of mechanically, right? Not without going into further details, but some of these are really very powerful, mechanical devices created to measure response times in experiments. Experiments, the idea was subtraction method used, to create one task that has two processes. And then, for example, do you see the light or not? Press this button or not to measure time. And then create another task that will insert one more mental process. For example, now do you see left or right light, for example, right? Insertion of the additional process makes second task a little bit more complex, but add one more mental process. So the doctors resonated very, logically say, well, we just have to measure response time for this process, response time for that one, subtract, and the difference here would actually correspond to the duration of that inserted process. It was an ingenious idea at the time. First, you have to capture processes that are very fast. And second, you start to unpack the system that you do not see actually. Now, of course, there are some limitations to these ideas. And for example, just one of the objections was that later on, that insertion of another process actually may affect the other processes too. So this is not actually the best way of testing this thing. So how do we process with that one? We'll skip, almost 60 years of the research on that topic, started from Donders and then ending up here in the systems factorial technology. These are some of the names of the guys that push, the boundaries of this idea how to analyze processes using response times. We ended up with the system factorial technology and the seminal paper 2000. I don't think this is correct time, but the correct year is right. 29 years is since we have the seminal paper introduced by Townsend Nozawa, one of the most influential papers about the idea that kind of in an elegant way explain, how we can analyze complex metal architectures using response times. So this is the must to have literature in your research library. The book, for example, that was recently published also, showcased, some of these cases of tutorials and methodology that could be explained. And you can see the Professor Cheng Tai, the local professor here is one of the editors, contributed in it significantly. There's been really a lot of work of systems factorial technology. Jim, thank you for coming up with such a interesting, name, for the methodology. We're using, response times to analyze properties of the systems. And after the theoretical development, the years pass, there's a lot of, process of validation of this methodology. So the list is actually much longer than that one. The fundamental processes that you would like to reveal as we learn, from the professor's talk or Jim's talk is we would like to learn about the processing order. That is how processes are organized. Are they in serial or parallel? What is the scope of the search of information for a certain decision? So do we have to analyze all of them, which is exhaustive, or we can terminate, which is kind of a self-termination kind of a thing here? So is there any process dependency? Are the processes know or collaborate or inhibit each other during that engagement? And what is the processing capacity? So these are the four important questions. The theory behind, very basically at the abstract level, what is important to know that the methodology itself is non-parametric, which means that system technology does not require any specific conditions and expectations with regard, statistical properties of the variables involved, the random variables involved in this study. So, for example, from stats, Gaussian distribution or exponential distributions that could be used to characterize probabilistic processes, they will all work in the same fashion here. It doesn't matter. That means that we don't need parameters of these properties to be used to be described in the model, to really analyze the system. We analyze individual subjects, but the groups analysis are possible. And technically, it's a meta theory. It's not theory itself, but it's kind of a very useful tool to analyze processes, dissect them. So in the science, we have validation and falsification. So two major approaches. Validation is that you support your ideas through the converging set of converging evidence, or you can falsify certain ideas by providing evidence, that these ideas, are not really strong. So as actually system factorial technology is very strong at these kind of levels. It could be used to analyze other theories. Another look at the different types of mental architectures. Here we can see how they are related. As I said, processing order, again, here goes, through the how do we process. So for example, these two architectures A and B are serial architectures, processing eyes, then the lips, processing eyes, then the lips, makes serial. Parallel one means, C and D goes in parallel, right, that both eyes and lips are analyzed at the same time, right? And then coactive, it also, has this parallelity, they're picking up, this information in parallel. Stopping rule is the scope of a search. As I said, you can terminate early. For example, only eyes can jump. It doesn't have to go all the way through the lips, so it can jump in directly, lead to decision. That's the termination case, right? So the question is, can brain terminate? Do we have to analyze everything? It would be very economical if you don't have to analyze everything. In some cases, it seems like a pretty good idea. But in some cases, it's actually very smart to analyze everything that you have at your disposal before you make a decision. So this is called stopping rule, right? We have interdependency or process dependency. So all of these guys are directly independent. All these processes of eyes and lips are independent, but not in E, for example. We can see that eyes and lips are here funneled together in a single channel, forming a face or group together. So technically, that means they are becoming highly correlated at this level, which kind of makes them to be interdependent in the analysis. So we cannot really, in the system E, which we call coactivation, we really have a hard time seeing eyes and lips separate, right? And that looked similar to your recognition of the Taiwanese badminton player when you called, her by the name. You went directly, to this node here, and you really didn't pay attention to the eyes and lips, right? Eventually, you could do that if you're asked. But this kind of architecture, we believe, co-activation, is usually seen as a very good candidate to explain such a holistic phenomena. Do you have any questions about that?
I think it might be useful to mention that that's kind of a modern and more precise representation of the idea of the grandmother cells that go back in the history of neurology.
Yeah, maybe grandmother cell, So if you heard about these cases from neural studies, usually there was a Jennifer Aniston cell they found, the Friends character, and then find one patient that has open brain surgery, so they put electrodes in the brain, waiting for the real surgery, so do some experiments, and they show different pictures, and they figure out that one patient, only reacted, to the Jennifer Aniston picture, one cell in the brain, right? So they call this, it could be that cell too, yeah. So how they're created, how the systems exist, it's kind of hard to see, right? But cognitive approaches and systems factorial technology is one way to open the window inside the brain structure in a way, all right? That is way too complicated questions. I would like not to talk, spend much time because I need a half an hour probably. I will, try to treat it lightly here. The issues, interdependency between processes, could be seen as at different levels. This is just one way of looking at interdependency between processes.
I'll jump in real quick. Is that one very way of, like, I'm going to say the whole way would take a long time. If coactive model could be perfectly mimicked by a regular parallel model. So it's one way to see that characteristic. You get the same thing from that as if you're feeding everything.
Yeah, I'll show one example. I'll show one example that we'll see that. There are two statistics that system factorial technology relies. You probably know that, from the work with in your lab. The first one is called mean interaction contrast, and it is kind of a double difference between mean response times between four conditions here indicated LL, LH. You can see these conditions here. I'll provide you another tutorial how these are created. The best way to describe MIC is if you have been running ANOVA before. Have you been running ANOVA in statistical analysis? SPSS? Well, when you look for the interaction task between two factors with the two levels, MIC is actually the same result, right? But this is kind of in this kind of a version, it provides, significantly different information about the organization of cognitive processes. The one that is really favored by the researchers in this area is called Savave interaction contrast, and then it looks fairly the same as the mean interaction contrast, albeit that mean values here, RTs, are replaced with the Savave functions, and then Savave functions a function of time. So unlike these values here, the Savave interaction contrast is not a value, it is a function, so it gives some kind of a shape. So I'm not going to go into details, further. Jim, already, provided to brief you with much of the details. Savave functions could be observed from the data, could be estimated from the data collected in such experiments. So we see here 4 Savave functions, well, actually 2 of them superimposed over each other. So it's like a probability that you haven't finished processing yet. In the probability theory, there's all kinds of interesting, word combinations to describe, what is happening in the world of finishing processes. But Savave function is like telling us what is the survivability of a certain elementary process, mentally process. And it is very actually handy because if you calculate the integral of this equation here, if you do the simple integral from minus infinity to plus infinity, this will turn into that. So we see that MIC is actually kind of a special case of the SICs. It has more information, right? And that more information here is evident, when you look at the MICs and SICs associated with different types of architectures. So this is one type of architecture, serials that can terminate. This is serial that cannot terminate. This is exhaustive. This is a parallel self-terminating, parallel exhaustive, and coactive. And you can see the MIC values here. These points are mean reaction times for these conditions, as I said, as similar as to apply to ANOVA. But we can see how they are forming different patterns here. And on the right-hand side, we see that comparable patterns for the Savave interaction contrast, which kind of gives another flavor to what we can learn for the mean interaction contrast. That means each of these is associated with the different types of architecture. So Savave interaction functions are using to distinguish between different types of architectures, mental. So we don't have to open the brain, plant the electrodes to learn about the network. We can look at the response times in a carefully created task and check for the patterns. If they match, probably that's the type of architecture that neurons kind of take into consider when they are organized themselves. So coactive one, let's pay attention to this one because this one is important. It's positive most of the time, it has this negative part. Will show up later in some of the results. So this is what I'm bringing your attention to. It is very similar to this one, which is parallel termination, but it has this kind of a small negative giveaway kind of an attribute here. All right. In terms of the perceptual phenomena, we like to see how these are related to what we call as a holistic phenomena. Strong holistic phenomena is usually, in this case, associated with identification of signature of the coactive architecture. This is like strong holistic. We expect some of the phases, if they are really holistically processed, to show this property. Well, if they are analyzed in terms of the features, we should be seeing, these signatures of SSE, like flat stuff here, or mean reaction times that looks additive here, right? So this is that kind of arc. So seeing, that phase as a bunch of features, analyze feature one together, and be aware that these are independent features will make, that kind of signatures here. Other signatures poses kind of in between characteristics, some mixed analytic and holistic. Holism here comes in the form of exhaustive processing. The idea of the holistic is you have to analyze all information. So all exhaustive guys, this one and that one, has a little bit of holistic. But in the essence, they could focus on a single feature and use a single feature to stop their decision, but not this one. This one stops only when grandmother cells kind of fires up and then send this information. All right, so just to kind of try to visualize this stuff, we're going to be using this later. All right. What is the relationship, between a parallel and coactive, which is kind of seems like very close in similarity. So we can see like a bunch of the items analyzed, bunch of maybe facial features analyzed in parallel systems, Is there any relationship here? Well, technically, one can think of maybe this type of architecture, coactive architecture. Let me see how this works. Coactive architectures, pulls all these features together and then form this kind of a internal representation that's been compared to the memory, and then we can use almost like a template matching here. So this is what is going on here. In parallel architecture, we see that these guys are going in parallel, they're all analyzed, one by one. Technically, you can create maybe, this is the theoretical idea, the coactive architecture out of the parallel one, right? If you have this one with the 4 processes and somehow impose, facilitation and let these guys exchange their information. So we see this positive sign here is kind of allowing facilitation between these feature detectors here. They could kind of collapse, with enough form of this facilitation into single channel, right? They become, very correlated. That is, detectors becoming correlated, actually becoming one unit. And that could probably be the good way to maybe see how the holistic effects, can give a rise. All right, so this is one way to look at the coactive architectures here. How to apply this methodology in the practical sense, and most of you, as I said, been already introduced into this idea, but those of you, who would like maybe to see differently, the workhorse is the salience effect. So this is the process in mind, right? We don't see this one, right? But this one we control. This is external manipulation. As the researchers, the least amount of work that has to be done here is to create some manipulation, external manipulation that will affect the process of interests to either go slow or to go fast. So find some manipulation of the process that will slow it down or make it go faster. Once you identify that, you're almost ready, to run system factorial technology. And that's, how you can create, more complicated designs. Let's say that you have a network that is highly likely consisting of analyzing 2 maybe attributes, or maybe network with only 2 processes. So how do we apply this technology to such a network? Well, we have to find the external manipulation, external variable 1 that could be manipulated at one level, slow and fast, and another one is slow and fast. You cannot see, because of the red here, right? And then you have to create what we know as a double factorial paradigm. For example, if this is a simple serial system, but we don't know that, right? You create these 2 manipulations, slow and fast, and then they will create 4 possible conditions. Low here indicates slow. This is low saliency manipulation. High indicates fast. So low saliency and high saliency. So these are the synonyms, for speed, slowing down the processes. Another term is also like stretching the processes. Stretching the processes in time will create them to be slower. So L is slow or low saliency or slow processing. High is a high processing or high saliency here, faster processing. So this is how we get, these manipulations. Now that means you have to have at least 4 conditions, slow, slow. The factorial comes from the fact that they are factorially combined here, and more tutorials you can find on these papers over here that I provided. So that means you have a variable 1, factor 1, which is 2 levels, the low and high, and variable 2 with 2 levels, low and high. And orthogonal manipulation of these properties will create these 4 conditions. This is what factorial comes from in the systems factorial technology. Right? So this is the least requirement, the minimal requirement for these studies to detect at least, network with at least size of 2. But more processes will require higher level factorials. We'll talk about this next time. Maybe I can give you another paper. All right, so we're gonna go across this. How to calculate Sevavi functions, then in this case, now here is one categorization experiment in which we have 2 dimensions. We can see that we manipulated 3 levels of the facial properties here, here, here. We created a bunch of faces, and this line here indicates category A. These are category B. So these will be recognized as one group. These are recognized as another group here. And the position of these guys here will have the properties of the high and low saliency. High and low saliency here is determined by actually proximity of the face to the opponent category members. And because of the similarity between these items, in terms of the brain, these are less discriminable cases at the level of features. So that means analysis on the eye separation for that face and the lips position for that face is slower than for this guy. For that case here, which is further away from this guy, you see how the face is more compact, right? Because their properties in the lips position and eye separation changed. So these guys will identify faster in both features. But this will be sufficient number of conditions here to test factorial stuff. What we do run hundreds, 200 studies, trials, per face conditions. We create, 4 frequency distributions that could be maybe used to estimate density functions for the high, high, low, low for these 4 guys here. And then the simple mathematical manipulation will turn this into the estimated survival functions. First, cumulative distribution functions, just try to accumulate these frequency values from this histograms here, and then take 1 minus that will create Sevavi function for this particular condition, and do this, for all 4 conditions. Will create, 4 Sevavi functions that are associated with these 4 conditions. So this is all technically done in a very simple way, and probably most of you are familiar with the process, right? So we'll take just the difference and some double difference of these items according to the equation, and the resulting thing, should be Sevavi interaction contrast function that usually has identified certain shape. In this case, you see the function is negative. Do you remember which one of the signatures was mainly negative? Very, very good. Yeah, that's excellent. So we can see, do they really exist? Well, as Jim said, long-term validation of this method, actually showed, most of these architectures clearly. So some of these studies here show that flat kind of a Sevavi interaction contrast comparing to belonging to serials terminating. We saw cases of a serial which is equal, negative, and positive parts here. I have this kind of a cross line point. We saw the parallel self-terminating. We saw parallel exhaustive. So these are discoverable and validation process that is, well, almost, still going on and maybe done. I would say, it's underway. So factorial technology provides stronger tests for identifications of mental architectures. It is very effective. You could, like Swiss pocket knife, you can analyze, all kinds of tasks. You just have to be clever to design these properties. And most importantly, it is non-parametric idea. So you don't have to make any assumptions about the underlying properties, probabilistic properties of these variables of interest, which is really extraordinary. Last condition means, very economical. All right, so how do we validate this? I'll show you, several groups of studies, that shows validation of the systems factorial technology in the domain of facial perception. We look at the separable versus integral stimulus dimensions, face categorization task, and we look, some kind of Wiggle effect here, or Wiggle, we call dynamical face effects. how these kind of, and how the factorial technology could be used to identify holistic properties. First, we start with the separable versus integral stimulus dimensions. Are you familiar with the topic, a little bit, So some perceptual phenomena indicates that certain types of stimuli could hardly be separated from each other in perception. These would be called, dubbed integral stimulus dimensions. And some properties are easily to be perceptually separable. Like maybe we could look at the color and saturation. For example, if you make a stimuli that has a color and has a line position here, and let's call this object 1, not only they're physically separated, but, mentally they could be easily, you can pay attention to this one, ignoring that one, and the other way around. So this is really highly separable kind of stimuli. But not all stimuli are really highly separable. The most interesting, for our group of phenomena are integral stimuli such as color and brightness. So brightness versus colors, a bunch of these color patches here that increases the amount of color saturation, the amount of red here, the amount of photons here. You got the bleaker pictures. But when you look each of these, it is hard to perceptually see and answer the question to what extent this is red from to what extent this is like a less or more bright in a way. So this makes a case of integral stimuli. You can see maybe as a face as another case of we don't know that, right, whether it's separable or integral. We believe that faces, if it is true, they're highly likely to be integral stimuli. But anyway, we started the whole idea first with testing integral versus separable stimuli, which is kind of known in literature. So this would be color and saturation tests and line position and saturation analysis. So the hypothesis here, the coactive architectures would be observed in the case of integral dimension stimuli, and then no coactivation, that is the other types of architecture. We doesn't have to be specific here, but we don't expect to be just coactive. It could be parallel or serial. We just have to check that, So that's the main idea. And so we run the studies, this is the results, for the separable dimension stimuli. The study was published, in 2008, Jim was also co-author. As we can see that most of the architectures here are either serial or something that kind of a flat or look serial here, parallel exhaustive. And most of them is actually not showing any signs of coactivation. And so the stimuli, and this kind of a cocktail, after a long day at work in the lab, made of separable stimuli dimensions are actually showing, not sign of a coactivation. So that's very good. Now, if you use integral dimension stimuli, the results are quite obvious. You can recognize this coactivation here, the larger positive part, the negative part, only one intersection. So it's pretty strange converging evidence to support the idea that integral stimuli present, some form of coactive signatures. Again, if you can compare them, you can see, like a clearly identification of coactivation in that type of stimuli. So you can find the paper here, 2008, with Nosovsky and Townsend. Okay, so this was very good. When you say, how about our key hypothesis? The first one confirmed. The second one kind of not really exactly specified, but kind of confirmed, what we can see, from the results. So this was the first step, in the development of system factorial technology to analyze holistic phenomena. The second one will be in the domain of a categorization of faces. And categorization of faces, as I said, we expect, to see that faces are actually holistic stimuli, as we just demonstrated at the beginning. So we tend to see faces as a unit type of information. We also can expect that maybe faces should show at least maybe exhaustive processing, but not self-terminating processing. Exhaustive means that we kind of mandatory perceptual obligation to look of all features, not isolate the single ones. Right? So this is another maybe corollary hypothesis. The third one could be that the type of facial context, should also have the effect. The faces that we learned before. And if you pay special attention to some features, facial features, it'll be much easier to identify them in their original facial context. If you put the same features in another facial context, we expect, to break down this holistic processing. So this is the facial context effect. known faces, familiar faces, should create this probably co-activation, and everything else, should break it down. So we run, analysis on the, it was my PhD, part of my PhD thesis, but there's also a paper here you can find in 2010 with Jim Townsend here. Faces were manipulated across configural features. So we assume that in a brain/mind, there's detectors that analyze separation between eyes, right? So these guys, can fire probably with a certain rate, if the eyes are too separated or closely separated, it's like configural facial features. And then lips positions with respect to nose was another detector. So like two-dimensional problem, again, two processes. We would like to cover how these two processes in a simple fashion, operate in a facial detection. And then the types of facial contexts were determined here by the all face. This is how the face were learned. We pay attention to these two feature properties in the original face, which is called old face, right? This is the one that you learn the most. And then we, in the test phase, we only presented these facial features without facial context features only, and we embedded them in a different facial context, like new face, right? But same two features. Maybe if you have a hard time, if you pay close attention, the distance here are the same, right? But the context changes. So we expect to see co-activation probably here when tested, but kind of a non-co-activation here, maybe serial analysis, but analytic analysis here, right? So that's the idea. We use the similar structures. This is a so-called OR task, an AND task, which Jim mentioned. I think I can give you some kind of also information. This task here that you have to learn 5 faces allows for single feature to terminate processing. So this is called analytic friendly, right? How that allows, for example, if this face has been presented here, then you can only look at the eye separation here, and then judging are the eyes closer to this bound or not. If they're not, that's the face hero, and you can just finish. You don't have to pay attention to the lips at all. The same thing in likewise for the lips position. You don't have to pay attention to the eye. So this is like analytic friendly. We don't know whether perceptual system will use that opportunity, but we'll just can test it this way. And condition, you cannot really terminate. For these guys, you have to analyze them all here, but for these guys, you can terminate. So it's kind of combination of the two. They're called OR and AND design. And then we have that, for the old faces, and then we have features only. How we manipulate the saliency. Saliency is manipulated by the distance between the facial marginal feature projections on each dimension. So for example, this eye separation here for both of these faces is very close to the hero case, so that makes them a little bit, hardly to discriminate. So that slows them down, right? Slowing. There was a slow push. But these guys here, you see like the eyes are more closer here. So that is really different than the opposing category member. So this would be the fast manipulation. So slow and fast here. And you can find the same thing slow and fast on this dimension. So they will create, these factorial conditions. We do this, pretty much, copy and paste, for the other conditions. And then the results here are for the OR task, so this disjunctive rule stimulus task, we see that subjects, they could terminate, and the architecture is, if you can look at the mental catalog of these architectures, we see that that's mainly positive function, which is associated with a parallel self-terminating analysis. So they terminated when they can, but both features are analyzed at the same time in the OR condition, right? Yes. That's right. Very good observation. So the first hypothesis is actually not mine, myself. I'm not going to clean my hands out of that. It is generally accepted in the large community of researchers who work on the facial perception, that faces are holistic, right? So we use this as a kind of a yardstick, right? And it's okay to show that this hypothesis fails. And it here technically fails. So we cannot really say, we'll see that in the final conclusions, we cannot tell that the faces are holistic. It is possible to create a task in which you can go and pay attention to particular feature and do separable kind of analysis of the facial properties. So excellent observation. So yes, that was this signature here. So that the or condition task, use this kind of architecture, right? So now we see like putting, things together, right? Remember, we don't see these processes. Cannot open the brain. We cannot plant electrodes. We can make inferences about them indirectly from the analysis of these patterns. For the end conjunctive rule, we found at least 3 subjects showing coactive architecture. So the other condition forced somehow some of the subjects to use coactivation. Yeah, so this is that one here, right? Which we believe, presents the evidence for strong holistic analysis. We also look at the mean reaction times, and we see that across different facial contexts. Now let's analyze SFT across facial contexts, old face, feature alone, and new faces. These are error levels, the right-hand side, response type, left-hand side. We see that all faces, of course, in a process with the least amount of errors, and then the fastest when compared to 2 cases, which is a good sign. It's typical finding in the literature. The question is, what kind of mental architecture has been used to analyze these kind of between different conditions? In particular, how did we do it with all cases? And as I said, some of the subjects 7, 8, 9 show the coactive architectures, while the other subjects, show, for the old faces, show all kinds of plethora of different architectures. But, the first thing, although it doesn't look there's no system in order, most of these architectures has been recognized. All right, so we didn't get, unexpected shapes, responses fall in one of those 5 categories here. And then we'll see later on the final, how that actually hold this kind of a difference will start to make more sense. But we see that there's a substantial individual differences across these conditions. Some of them using serial architecture, where we can identify, some of them using parallel, some of them using coactive. And that is another important aspect of the factorial technology, which allows for individual assessment of the data of the analysis. And it is realistic to assume that individuals will have maybe different form of, or maybe properties of their, maybe even perceptual processes. But we know later on that high-level cognitive processes are all different, right? So this comes a very important tool to look at the individual differences. So as noted, this is not confirmed, right? So faces are not necessarily holistic. We can see some cases of holism probably identified, but in many tasks, and it's been repeated across many tasks in our laboratories, there's not strong evidence that some of our tasks are not really putting the subjects in the holistic perceptual analysis form. Well, what is interesting is the scope of the feature search was kind of confirmed. I didn't really show the details, but that in the end condition, as we manipulated, it really leads to indicating of exhaustive processing when you analyze this stuff. And then or condition that is termination friendly showed, mainly self-termination. So that was kind of a good. In terms of identification of some processes, it seems like, this is a pretty useful tool. And so finally we have type of facial context. And then, although we find some support, that all faces are processed coactively, it didn't happen for all subjects. And why didn't it happen? So this is really good question. So it's kind of half confirmed. And we see that substantial individual differences there. Subjects, maybe approaching differently to perceptual situations. And then finally, things, that started to put, also this analysis together was about the snake wiggle effect, right? The snake wiggle effect is dynamical effect of the holistic perception as a reviewable system factorial technology. So the key hypothesis here is what is happening with the identification processes when we look at the practice effect. As because we have many trials and many sessions, our subjects are getting better and better. This corresponds to the expertise effect. The expertise is found to be very closely related to the holistic phenomena. And becoming an expert in a certain field, that is recognizing faces, maybe from being a toddler to being, adult, could be the part of the forming expertise in the facial perception that happens through practice. So babies pay attention to faces and some of the facial features. So maybe the practice effect, could reveal some important information. We call this dynamical effect, dynamical change of these properties. Also, is it possible that the practice will induce mental architecture switching? So maybe we can start with one type of architecture and we switch to another type of architecture as we become more experienced, right? Maybe we start with the serial first and then we become more coactive later on. And then the idea here is that all training should leave that the faces would reach the level of holism, which means they will point, to the direction of the forming of co-activation signature. Okay, so the three hypotheses here. And so here is the snake wiggle effect. Why did I call it snake wiggle? It's like a post-effect analysis. So you can see that this kind of a line of wiggles, almost like it's live structure. It looks like kind of a snake form. So I thought the name is appropriate, right? So how do we get this thing here to wiggle this way? Well, we break down the analysis one subject. The subject started with a parallel exhaustive signature. And then over the course of training, the SIC function started to change. As you can see that the change moves, moving this belly, negative belly upward. So that is what is happening here, here, and here, until the moment that the belly becomes larger than the negative part. And the positive part of the belly, that kind of effect. So if you put all these frames together, this is what you get. All right. So what is here? 2 sessions per figure, lots of trials. I don't have on the top of my hand, so as several hundred, trials there. So as we see again, the subject started to being parallel exhaustive, and it seemed like ended up in the co-activation. So think about, is it like maybe switching between the processing styles? Right? So this could be support for one of the hypotheses. When we analyze all the subjects, this is the average area under the curve. So it's negative, then becomes positive. So this is what happens across many subjects. They start, most of them on average started negative, and they move, and then become positive over the course of training sessions. So all subjects, show the same trend of changing. Remember, all paths during building expertise will lead, to a co-activation. That positivity means, they're going probably to have a larger positive part than negative parts. At the same time, when we look at the response times and accuracies, that is the practice effects, we find the typical practice effects from the session 1 to the last one. Their reaction time decreases. And then the same thing with errors. They're becoming experts. How they're becoming experts? Well, it seems like, they're switching between different types of architectures here. And then overall, we can see that actually most of these guys are ended up, in forming coactive signatures. Not all of them, but most of them, end up in the coactive signature. So altogether, we have analysis that we have a converging of evidence indicating that build-up of expertise over the course of training creates, leads, to the case of the coactive architecture. One way to, yes?
Hi, made a connection between phases and the expertise, and maybe their time to bring expertise changes in that picture and the skill we get. Could you maybe speculate, or if you start about this unique reason, or if you let me look at anything else, and you run through many sessions, my snake we can do the same.
Very good question. So one of the biggest questions in the broader theory of psychological phenomena is the effect of practice and training. What does it affect? All right? Since we have, usually relatively complex networks of processes involved in tasks involving a memory or involvement of different types of mental architectures, does the memory get better? Does the representation become cleaner? Is this process of evidence accumulation better at removing the noise? Are we switching to the more optimal strategies to integrate information from the multiple sources? Are we switching between the hypotheses? So this is one of the fundamental questions that goes beyond, forming expertise in facial perception, but goes in other practice effects, learning that, are related to the education, to any kind of learning. So answer to that question, I don't know what happens with the other type of tasks and problems. We observe that clearly because we have lots of money here and thank you, Jim, for providing, for the PhD work. So, but we could observe that effect in face perception. It would be good to see whether that will work in the other domains. And then we just have to follow the saliency manipulation slow and fast, creating the tasks. It could be, as I say, education. It could be memory retrieval. It could be any other types of task. We expect to see, that this tool could help you to figure out what is happening. Here's one alternative explanation to this task switching is that our subjects started analytic at the beginning, and then somehow they build up, their holistic expertise. Maybe at the beginning of our task, because it's not easy task, they have to pay attention. Okay, let's learn these features. So learn to categorize A's from B's. It's not easy task, but I try to do my best. So they started first to pay attention. Let's look at this. Oh, here's this feature. Here's that feature. Okay, all right. And then over time, they start to build up, stronger connections through the process dependency violations, or actually through the facilitation of the facial feature detecting, to creating more compact representations, to maybe maxing these out toward the end after becoming experts into one kind of grandmother exemplar units that, have these template units that have, the whole object themselves, reaching, the top level of hierarchical representation of these features. And that could be done, interestingly, this could be done in one of the networks that Jim showed here, if we just allow for these processes to communicate during the evidence accumulation. You can actually create these three levels of the perceptual effects: analytic, semi-holistic, to holistic effects. In matter of fact, when we use this network to simulate parallel exhaustive processing, and we increase the number of exchange of information, increase the facilitation level between the channels, what is happening with the SEC function starts to, exactly as you observed in the Wiggle, starts to go upward. This is just in a simple simulation. Probably it would be actually a good time for me to put this together and try to do some kind of a parameterized model filling, try to see whether I can get it better, maybe from parametrical point of view. But this is just in a simulation showing that this signature that you observed in a snake wiggle could be easily created, not by switching mental architecture hypothesis, but by relaxing the idea the processes are independent here and allowing them to communicate to become interdependent. So single thing can create the dynamical snake wiggle effect. So there is interaction, changing the level of interaction between facial feature detectors. All right, so snake wiggle perception. The practice effect confirmed really shows up in all of the subjects. And in actually, most of the subjects show the same trend. That works with the number 3. So that was confirmed. Architecture switcher, well, after these analysis, I would say there's alternative explanation, right? We could say that maybe they switched from parallel exhaustive to coactive, but we can also here argue maybe that they didn't change. They got tuned their parallel architecture better to allow for channels to communicate. So kind of a maybe confirmed, but with the exclamation mark. And the facial training really, all the subjects actually were led in the same direction. So that means, you know, probably with enough expertise, some subjects will really become coactive. All right. So here's the conclusion here. We have 3 types of validations of the approaches to use holistic perception analysis using system factorial technology. And we use, you know, first one, separable versus integral dimensions. We found the evidence for coactive processing associated with the integral stimuli dimensions. In the phase categorization task, we found evidence for coactive processing, but we also find evidence in the large individual subject differences. We find good alignment with the stopping rule and the task demands, which kind of also validates technology. We also find evidence that faces are not holistic. Yeah, and so that's kind of interesting. So that, you know, that means it's task dependent probably. Maybe faces are holistic in another, I say, framework or another natural environment, but in a laboratory task, such as this one, they couldn't really be processed holistically, except maybe in some cases. Dynamical phase effects show the practice effects, show the evidence for architecture switching, but also for architecture tuning effect. And then we are able to see that, you know, actually the roads lead, you know, to a co-activation. This kind of supports this idea that there must be something associated with the signature of the SFT, and then these similar related groups of phenomena, such as holistic, integral versus separable dimension stimuli, or maybe expertise building. SFT, suite of tools to analyze and decompose mental processes without poking brain with electrodes, so you can see what is happening inside, right? So that provides opportunity for you see the guys at the bottom, all neural studies. More connections are required. So each one of you guys may be taking this route. It may be a good idea to bring some of these ideas to the new lab research. It could be used for the model selection. Validation and falsification of processes means that you can maybe falsify some of the beliefs of support some theories, or maybe you can support the other theories by identifying certain properties. This is a big alternative to parameter-dependent approaches. As I said, SFT is non-parametrical method, means no assumptions about underlying statistical properties of the random variables. They could be Gaussian, they could be exponential, they could be whatever you think, you know, they could be. All these different types of properties will still not affect identification of the signatures. Networks could be extended to the 2, 3, 4. You can find some papers, you know, if you visit the link. Future exploration, you know, probably should go into the domain of these maybe neural studies, you know, try to see if there's any connection. And maybe the other studies like expertise building, you know, and certain other domains. But definitely the validation and all these phases are now applied, you know, to different domains and the research, you know, so in terms of the using system factorial technology. And I'll talk in Taipei about one approach that gets some of these ideas, you know, how this facial perception could be analyzed following some of these ideas, you know, using slightly different approach. All right, any questions, guys? Thank you.
Thank you for your. I want to add one point. The first question is that so we mentioned in your time you showed the learning expectation and the capture. I can see the experience tree and their better architecture tricks to the pointing parts. So in this case, I was wondering that the better architecture, like the cognitive control, for example, with that,
that an expert would use this project based research to process to pick out more automatic process or more unconscious projects. So, yes, fine.
So the answer to that question is, you tell me, what do you think, what is the blueprint of expectation of such a network? How do you think, what is your expectation of such a network? How do you think this network is organized? You have to identify the processes of interest that are key to understand this network, or 2 or 3, right? So this application, SFT, can go, to the higher level as well, but 2 is usually the easiest way. And then find a experimental approach that will allow the manipulation of slow and fast, find the manipulation that can speed up or slow down the key processes, assuming so-called selective influence at place. So once you do that, you can start, testing the ideas of the possible underlying mental network. But you have to start first with the blueprints. I think one of my students, was also interesting. He said, can we do this for the reading of the characters? And there's some of the research here was about the reading, how the reading occurs, right? So we have the same approach, right? So the reading in English, for example, goes in a certain order. There's eye movements, but we know that we're seeing the words almost instantaneously. Maybe it's like a holistic effect too. So he said, let's investigate this. Say, okay, here's the first step. Find me for the blueprint of your model that is used, cognitive model that could be used to explain reading and word comprehension. And we found the 2 models. And we found, several components of the model that had already existed in the literature, in linguistics. And there's one was assuming actually serial, the other is assuming parallel analysis. And then once we identify the properties of these models, we say, let's validate which one is correct. And so once we do that, we say, okay, here's the key feature that we have to slow down. Here's the key feature we have to speed up. And here's another feature. And so let's see what happens here, whether we can go. So it has to start with a model construction first, identifying the components, getting nitty-gritty with experimentation. So find the manipulation that will make, processes slow down or speed up, and then, create enough conditions so you can start applying this analysis.
Another question is that in one slide you show, for sport and distribution for the different levels of facilitation on SIC content. And all of them will show no facilitation, other facilitation, and the strong facilitation. And I wonder that in some cases, the protocol will be inhibitory in change. So they will have any facilitation on the different case. SIC.
Oh, that is a good question. So it all depends on the model yet. So as I said, this is a meta theory. The way I pose this problem is a meta theory. So I'm not necessarily here making strict assumptions about what type of a connection should exist between certain processes. If they exist, it will be revealed in a certain type of interactions. Now, we know that from the working of the neural systems, and then we also know from the many other types of approaches, theoretical approaches, there are maybe ways the communication that can occur between units could be positive or could be negative, could inhibit each other. So some of the research, especially here, Ami, and also Jim, I think you show, maybe Joe, and you can indicate, that different types of interactions between the units can maybe or may not create sufficient evidence, to distinguish between some of these signatures. But it is kind of an interesting topic and an interesting area for further exploration. Probably Ami would be the best, researcher, because, he kind of also explored, he has one of the papers exploring, some of these networks at, like at practical problems. I have one approach here that has this property hidden inside the computational model that, depending on the structure of the stimuli, but not on the kind of your expectations, on the structure of the stimuli, position of certain properties of the system can create positive or negative facilitation between items. But that's just theory, right? So it is maybe this is like a hard spot, and a very good spot, actually to start to further develop, these theories and bring them to another level. All right, guys, yes.
Really fascinating. I love the way you're pulling together like a number of experiments and over time with all your own. I noticed that while watching this, that some of these aspects that still might be open, I think will help to be adjudicated or decided by our new oncoming synthesis purity of SRT. So, for example, if we're able to study GRT as well as SRT across your stages of learning, we hopefully, in principle, can learn about the correlations across the channels. So it could be, in principle, say, let's take that model and compare it with a model that would lead to true co-activation as opposed to a mathematical similarity. So let's look at say one way of getting that would really be appreciated by the dynamic systems and the engineers people would be the idea that you have templates of the two features that are more or less independent to start with, and you're matching those, right? And then as time goes on, more composition of these things. You've got now a template of the whole thing. Well, that's going to give you very collective results if you're taking, for example, match filter correlation of the input of these things. And hence, I think the GRT characteristics might be very, very different from these guys.
Yeah, so a GRT, for example, theory here would provide this basis of the mental properties, the mental representation, as Professor Townsend, that showed. The theory also explains what is happening in the memory level. How is information that we use in perception and cognition, how it has been treated and stored and represented in our cognitive space. And then, but also explains how this information has been used and utilized and use it for the practical purposes in decision making, right? When you have to decide, okay, I see that, I see this, I'm gonna buy this, I'm gonna do that. So that makes, the full theory of cognitive operations, right? Covering the range, of the basic processes, the memory, representation, decision making, evidence accumulation, and then we also ask the questions about how the processes are integrated, organized, and multiple information together. How do we use them, to make maybe one outcome of that? So that makes, the theory full, and then that's the goal, right? So we're all marching in the same direction, and some researchers maybe strongly focus on one aspect, some of the researchers strongly focus on another aspect, but some of the researchers are, like try to be more integral and then try to combine all these properties. So this could be a good idea, yeah.
Thank you. I would like to ask you a science fiction question.
Yeah.
I know it's something that you like, science fiction. Because your work gets very close to establishing a causal relationship between the structure of the model and the set of them somehow, the process becomes more and more effective or more integrated and over time is built up. I wonder if you could fast track the process, meaning that right now it takes a lot of time for me to establish that new holistic set.
Yeah.
But maybe now in the far future, you can find a way, if you know it, the underlying model is a particular structure, can you do something to my brain to change the circuitry to the kind better and faster in letting those requests?
Yeah. Well, I'll be talking to some guys, with the implementation. Like
So can you see a hypothetical future where I do just a correlation in the calculation?
Yeah, my answer is, it's not science fiction. We already did that. I mean, I didn't do that. Certain drugs, probably can do the job, like cross-firing, certain systems and then bypassing some of the properties of architectures so they can create, unexpected outcomes that, twist it and changes our perception. So that happens, but it's not really under the control. If you take some stimulants, though, such as amphetamines, or if you can help me, guys, here I'm not really something that, like improves, cognitive functions, cocaine or similar stuff, speed up the processes. You can, in time, probably do that and reduce, certain amount of noise and certain amount of properties that are kind of bothering or maybe slowing down our perception. Hallucinogenic stuff, probably will change, things, in a very different way. So people report, some very strong strange effects, when using some of these things, that do not exist at all, or, have different forms, probably, indicating who knows what is happening somewhere in the system. Is it memory? Is it the way we are combining? Is everything together garbled? So these are good questions, right? Can we improve the functions? The question is, can this be used to improve the learning quickly, right? Yeah, so I don't know. That's the practical problem. And as far, I may have just, few ideas as you can have. I mean, each one of you guys can get the ideas from such influences and maybe become rich and famous by just, having this, they didn't see that thing, yeah. So you can patent this thing, maybe, become, later on, the who knows what, and then I ask you later on, how did you get this idea? Well, that was a TMCP, conference, in Taiwan that I once, kind of a really good, time. And then, yeah, so this is the world of ideas, right?
Things that might or might not relate to Ami's good question, but might be related to both the structure and function of the dynamic system, might be what's going on with the rest of the space parts while we're just manipulating two features. It could be that the overall parts of the space are actually kind of like distractors, but you're kind of slowing down the formation of gestalt over time. That's a question, empirical, I don't know, but it's a possibility. And that might lead to trying to do factorial stuff with more features.
Yeah.
Another thing is kind of related would be to create different features or faces by doing more continuous noise. I think Goldstone and Sniper probably did something like that years ago.
Dane Little, did that too, right?
Like that, so you've got a continuous deformation thing rather than individual features. So that might, give somewhat different results too.
Well, this is just a very, this is approximation of what is really going. We try to capture the moment of perception and cognition, sometimes in a very brief period of times, but that process is continuous. It's like dynamic. It's going all the time, right? And so we're now talk about small piece of it, right? And then more yet is to be discovered here.
Yeah, one final thing would be to, and I think this could be of interest in a lot of different domains in Gestalt things, would be to contrast, and I've never seen this really done, but to contrast factors that might tend to make the object less Gestalty. So if you make the eyes really bright, for example, or salient, that may actually change the face a bit and make it a little bit less Gestalty, as opposed to like some of your experiments with similarity and some of these kind of ideas as factors that do not really kind of distort or argue against the confirmation of Gestalts.
Open for the discussions, guys.
Well, this is one of the fascinating things.
I think I have the similar delay question about stuff.
Yeah.
Helen and I are, is it possible to make to use the analytic process or to make the separate so is there other top-down factors?
Yeah. So this is one of the interesting questions. And then Jim, puzzled me with that question, similar question some time ago, right? So we talk about expertise here, and then we think some things are kind of a learn. You kind of build some knowledge, restructure your cognition to get to that point. Let's say maybe that makes sense when you think about perceptual learning. One of the reasons why we don't remember most of the stuff when we're really small, because, this representation is all around. So it's very hard to memorize all these billions of those features, right? If higher level process didn't work, there was nothing, there to be integrated and memorized. There are too many things, so it's better not to learn. But one thing is that probably some of the stuff is being hardwired. And that's a very good question. So Jim pointed, a few years ago, that question, you pop up with that question. So some of the things, and particularly with the integral simile, may be hardwired. They already exist there. You cannot separate them. So the architecture inside is just not, it's not really, you cannot really through the learning separate it. It doesn't seem to make such a case, easy case. And I think, that particularly in visual perception, some of the important properties, such in object perception, may not be really separable by learning. Maybe you can find some tricks, how to do that. But I don't think it's going to be really good. So this is really good question. What is happening? Do we have some hardwired things that cannot be really done? Some people argue the faces are the same thing, right? So we are born with a part that will become this fusiform or whatever area that will be only good, for facial detection, right? So maybe it just needs a little bit of time, maturity, and then it starts, right, of a life of its own. Some perceptual problems, people having some, but you cannot really experiment much with that, is that they are able to see objects, but not the details of the objects, and then this kind of gives kind of a dissociation between this. So these are like a good cues, what is happening in the mind. So exploration about this property is still open, I guess. We know a lot, yeah. But that's thank you.